decides not to kill Agamemnon, Athena, the goddess, is often associated throughout the works of Homer with a kind of rationality, with an ability to plot, with a cunning intelligence. So the fact that it's Athena, very clearly, just as Apollo is the god of archery, so Apollo would appear when Paracelsus' good bow shot, Athena would appear when Achilles has his clever second thought. So it is a good reading, but it's not a complete reading. There are aspects of the epiphany of Athena that can't be reduced to the metonymic way of talking about intelligence. And in particular, if you think Athena came from heaven, set like a goddess, white-armed hero, for in her heart she loved them both alike. That's not metonymic, that's not allegorical. That is part of it. That's a realistic, epiphanic way of understanding the goddess. So she can't just be a manifestation of Achilles' thought processes. She's also part of the plot. So once again, we get the sense that Homer is very slippery. It is very hard to put your finger on what concept of the divine is actually operating here, between, on the one hand, the epiphanic model, and on the other hand, the metonymic model. Now, you might be thinking that it's in the nature of gods that they occupy categories that aren't reducible to conventional ideas of literal and figurative. Because when we speak of supernatural intervention into our world, we are ipso facto bending the linguistic categories that are designed for the natural world. You're never going to find language that adequately expresses the idea of God. The capacity of natural language to treat gods is always going to be limited. That's true, I think, but that's not enough. It doesn't tell the whole story. And my view is that the Greeks adopted a fluid understanding of the gods, which slid between the overly counterintuitive, let's say imagining gods as real anthropomorphic agents in our world, and the overly intuitive, which is imagining them as entirely naturalistic, as simply as representations of things that are entirely banal and normal in our worldview. This instability is absolutely necessary, because neither pole in itself can actually work. Now let's go back to our first passage on that handout, Eros and Danas. Again, once Eros and Danas, two forceful gods, that grip the soul, they drive it to ecstatic shamelessness. And let's think a little bit more about Eros, the god for sexual desire. Now, as I mentioned at the start, the metonymic shift between the god Eros and the concept of Eros, of desire, is facilitated by homonymy, by the fact that it's the same word that describes both. The question of whether to capitalise that initial letter, the initial E, is a constant problem for modern editors. When people produce new text, they always worry, what should it be capital on? But this simply didn't pose itself for ancient readers and writers. And yet, Eros is not just a personification. People often talk about personified deities. Eros is not just a colourless abstraction with no anthropomorphic individuating features. In Achilles' Tatius, he's described on a number of occasions in very anthropomorphizing terms. So, for example, he's described at the start as flying, there's a painting, a description of the painting at the beginning, and he's described as flying in the sky, pointing the way to Crete with his fingers and smiling. Elsewhere, he's referred to in the text with his traditional iconographic attributes, the bow, the wings, and the torch, and so forth. So Eros is not just sexual desire, Eros is also a deity. And in fact, outside of Achilles' Tatius, he's worshipped with ritual. The famous temple for Eros was in Thespiae in Greece, but there are a number of other places where he was worshipped. And spelt slightly differently, with a short O rather than a long O. He's already in Hesiod, one of the earliest Greek poets, a primeval deity belonging to the first generation of creation of the world. So Eros is not just an abstraction, Eros is also a deity in his own right. He's not a full deity, he's always linked to sexual desire and reproduction at some level. So unlike Dionysus, who is a complex god who has many different aspects and can be worshipped in many different forms, Eros, however he's depicted, he can be old or young, he can be benign or baleful, but always at some level is sexuality. And this takes us back to the problems raised by the principle of immanence, if you like. When we say eros has seized me, the question it raises is much greater than simply whether to capitalise the letter or not, or whether the word refers to a god or an emotional complex. The central question is whether and how gods inhabit our world, where we're to see the lines between religious and non-religious explanations for things in our world. Now, personifications of this kind have been quite well studied in Greek culture, and they offer, we might say, an extreme collapsing of the metonymic conflation that takes Dionysus as a substitute for wine. With personifications, God and concept become almost entirely interchangeable. If you say fortune is favouring you, the question of whether you're referring to chance or whether you're referring to a deity called fortune is arbitrary at one level. Does it really matter? Now, of course, at one level you might say, well, that's just a literary kind of issue. In most cases, you can actually tell whether you're talking about a god or a concept through religious worship. Okay, so if you are offering ritual sacrifice to Eros or to fortune, then we might say, obviously you're treating the concept as a god. The ritual frame determines, prescribes the divinity of the deity in question. But I'm not even sure whether that's the case. There are a number of instances of deities, personified abstractions, that seem to have a minimal level of cult activity, which doesn't fully resolve the question of whether they are gods or not. So Aeschines, for example, the 4th century orator, claims that there is an altar of rumour at Athens, Thermae in Greek. The altar was, so Scholiast on Aeschines tells us, dedicated when the Athenians received some good news about a battle. They thought, well, that's a great rumour, let's deify rumour and let's have an altar to her. But does this make rumour a god? Now, one question we'd really like answered, I suppose, is whether the altar was ever used and what it was used for. Did you sacrifice an animal on it? And if you did sacrifice an animal on it, well, at some level you must have been treating rumour as a deity. But I don't think even that is going to fully answer the question of whether rumour is a deity, because can you just simply take any abstraction, create a temple for it, and then through the act of ritual dedication turn that abstraction into a god? I don't think that's a question that Greeks could ever answer properly. How many altars does an abstraction need before they become a deity? Well, to take another example, in the Iliad, Phobos and Deimos are two figures, two brothers, who appear in the text. Now, these are both Greek words for fear, fear and terror. And in the Iliad, they are very obviously ways of describing the terror of battle. They're just metonymic ways of describing the horror of conflict. But the Spartans dedicated a temple to Phobos, to one of them, not the other, interestingly. Now, what kind of a god the Spartans thought Phobos was, how they imagined fear to be manifesting itself in the world through their sacrifices, that is a question that we simply cannot answer. And it doesn't do any good whatsoever to say, well, obviously that was religious practice, obviously that was Phobos became a religious category as a result of this. There was surely a constellation of positions available between full God and personified abstraction. And not only were individual figures placed at various points along this, in this constellation, but also different observers were located the same figures at different points. That's to say, some people might have thought, oh yes, of course, Phobos is a god, and some people might have thought, no, Phobos is just a god-like abstraction. So we're left, I'm just going to check the time actually, I tend to very short. We're left with a really fundamental question. Could the Greeks adequately define what a god was? Or to put the question slightly differently, who or what got to decide whether a given concept was a god? If the Athenians chose to consider rumour as a goddess, or if the Spartans chose to consider fear as a god, was it within their gift to do so? Can you simply redesignate aspects of normal humanity as a god simply through your own actions and your own agency and your own desire? Now, the issue is, I think, one of genuine structural incoherence within Greek theology, which is to say, these kind of problems are not just anachronistic modern footlings around, they actually go to the heart of theological and philosophical assumptions about the nature of the divine. And they were also, this is my closing peroration, if you like, they were also explored by ancients themselves and seen as centrally problematic aspects of Greek thought about the gods. So to take one example, in the 2nd century BCE, the charismatic head of the academy, the Platonic academy, Carneades, exploited precisely this slipperiness on the question of where gods sat on the spectrum between, or at least where individual, the slipperiness of the category leading from, the sliding scale leading from divinity to personification. Now, Carneades' argument used a variety of the philosophical argument known as the heaping argument, or the Sorites argument. In its original form, the Sorites argument goes something like this. So it's about defining the nature of a heap. Okay, how do you define a heap? If you have a single grain, you don't have a heap. That's obviously not a heap. 2 grains is obviously not a heap. 3 grains is obviously not a heap. And the point is that there is no point at which adding another grain will make the heap. Okay, so there's no, you can't say that 363 grains is not a heap, whereas 364 grains is a heap. So therefore, the idea of a heap is an unstable category that doesn't work, has no philosophical, rigorous definition. Now, Carneades' claim was that the same is true of gods. If you want to claim that Aphrodite and Eros are deities, why not other psychic affections? Okay, so again, if we declare that Aphrodite is a goddess, Eros, being the son of Aphrodite, will also be a god. Okay, but if Eros is a god, Helios too, that's to say Pity, will be a god. But both are psychic affections, and Helios has been worshipped like Eros. At any rate, amongst the Athenians, there are also some altars to Helios, to Pity. And if Helios is a god, so also is Phobos. Phobos is the god worshipped in Sparta. And in Phobos, then all the soul's affections. But we don't say that boredom is a god, for example, or peevishness, or anything like this. So the point is that if you're thinking about a sliding scale between more divine psychic affections and less divine psychic affections, just like the heaping argument, where you can't actually locate the cutoff point between that's where the heap starts and that's where the long heap stops. Similarly, with psychic affections, you can't actually locate the point at which emotions turn into gods. So therefore, he says the idea of God is an unstable category. Therefore, gods do not exist. Now, personification, you might think, is an extreme case, but personification is actually a central part of Greek religious thinking. And in fact, actually, it's more important than we might initially think, because the Olympian deities are associated with personified deities themselves. So Aphrodite is associated with Patho, persuasion, and Eros, desire. Zeus gets Eidos and Dicare, for example, shame and justice, and so forth. So these aren't just weird side issues in Greek thought, they're actually at the heart of things. And also, gods get, the mainstream Olympian gods get personifications as surnames as well. So Athena Nike in Athens, Athena of victory, where we get the round of trainers from, that sort of thing. Zeus Haetios, Zeus of the rain. Apollo Musegetes, Apollo leader of the Muses, and so forth. So personification is actually something, it's structural in Greek thought about gods. Now in such cases of personification, the theological problem raised is, I would argue, one of demystification. That's to say the god is over hastily disclosed to be identifiable with the real world element. And what that does is that reduces it to the level of the intuitive. This is a problem because it collapses the signified into the signified in a way that erases not only the sign, but the whole signifying project. There is no mystery left whatsoever. We don't say a stone stands for a stone in a relationship of signification, or a tree stands for a tree, or any such. The stone is the stone, the tree is the tree. And I think this is Carneades' point. If you say, for example, Phobos is Phobos, fear is fear, then actually you're not saying anything. At this point, then, the concept of the God risks a radical evisceration. Now, in my book on ancient atheism, I argued in brief that atheists flourished in ancient Greek culture because they could, because there was no sacred scripture holding people to theological orthodoxy, because there was no priesthood whose task it was to control beliefs, because polytheism encourages a pluralist worldview. That was, broadly speaking, a historical explanation. It was about the structure of Greek society that enabled atheism, in a way, to flourish. Okay. What I'm suggesting today is a different kind of explanation, and more of a, if you like, a philosophical, theological one. Greek culture was led to atheism by a kind of necessity embedded in its conception of deity. I've already hinted at the problems underlying Greek conception of divinity. That initial account from Trypho, when he talks about metonymy, defines metonymy, he talks about the meaning of the gods. What is the meaning of the gods? He says Dionysus means wine, semine is a Greek word. Hephaestus means fire, again semine. Greeks thought of their gods as signifiers, as visible traces of invisible, or incompletely visible powers. If you're locked into this way of thinking of divinity as signification, then the collapse into non-signification or personification, like Eros, a sign that simply you can self-refer to Eros the god refers too quickly to Eros the concept, cancels out its own semiotic status. Now, the idea that the names of gods are signifiers for real-life things was demonstrably the source for a number of 5th century atheist beliefs, particularly those of Prodicus and Democritus. So here's a bit of Prodicus. Prodicus, so this isn't Prodicus in his own words, it's a later paraphrase, and we don't have much Prodicus in his own words. Prodicus of Chios says that the ancients considered as gods the sun, the moon, the rivers, the springs, and absolutely everything that aids our life, on the grounds of the aid that comes from them, just as the Egyptians do with the Nile. And as a result, bread is thought of as Demeter, wine as Dionysus, water as Poseidon, fire as Hephaestus. So Prodicus' argument is that in primitive times, people had a way of denoting the natural foodstuffs of the world. Demeter is bread, Hephaestus is fire, and so forth. And in time, these modes of signification became misunderstood and mystified over time. So Prodicus' argument is that the mystification, counterintuitive mystification that we get in modern conceptions of religion is the result of error. Okay? There is no mystery about gods. It's just simply the case that Demeter means bread. And any confusion, any mystification that comes in is, as I say, simply a misunderstanding of the nature of that signification. But I don't want to get back into the questions of atheism. That's perhaps a story for a different time. I think enough has been said to show that ancient atheism found its target because of this distinctively Greek way of thinking about the gods, namely to think of them as signifiers, as bearers of meaning, thinking about them as names of words. It was never quite clear what they were signifiers of, and this became a particular problem with the rise of, in the 5th century, of sophisticated models and theories of language and the way in which signification works. What do gods mean was actually a very important, very kind of powerful question, and remained powerful in the 5th century. But, as I say, that's really a story for another day. I'd like to return, in my very last words, to the idea of dysfunctionalism that I raised at the beginning. Now, I don't think that the Greeks had a coherent idea of divinity. I think part of the incoherence was part of the attraction of it. It was a very powerful, flexible system that allowed people to get into it and do a lot of juicy work with these ideas of divinity. The fluidity, the very fluidity, made it workable for sure. So you could always escape the problems of, say, an epiphanic reading by saying, well, gods aren't really like that. They don't actually manifest themselves in our world in the way that Homer describes. Or, conversely, you could get out of the problems of an overly immanent, metonymic way of reading them. Well, of course, the gods aren't. Hephaestus is more than just fire. He's also a god with certain sort of anthropomorphic aspects to it. So you could always slide out of these kind of critiques. But the system did have its glitches, and these were exploited by its critics, people like Carneades and Prodicus, people that said that if you think hard about the question of what do gods mean, that ultimately leads you into atheistic position. In particular, as I say, I hope to have shown that the idea of Greeks of gods as denotative words, which was ultimately an attempt to explain the paradoxical, counterintuitive aspects, so a way of explaining how Paris and Apollo simultaneously could shoot a bow. This tended to remove the counterintuitive entirely, and so kill off the very god's divinity. So ultimately then, Greek atheism was a development within Greek religion itself. It was simply an amplifying reading of the glitches in the religious system. So Greek religion worked well enough. It was a powerful explanatory system, but it also contained within itself, I think, the tools for its own dismantling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely devastating inquiry into the nature of gods, which I'd never really thought about. Can I ask a question? I think we have about 15 minutes before drinks are served. Questions from the floor, please.
I'm just slightly confused because you're saying in this slide that they think of wine or bread like as. Hang on, let me rephrase. Okay, so you're saying wine is a god, according to the ancient Greeks. So instead of saying, so the wine isn't a god, it's just wine, that's what it means. But then you could also say that the Greek gods are saying that's what a god is, it just is these kind of like staples that we rely on. So maybe this is a different definition of god.
So I think the mainstream view is that Dionysus is a god who manifests himself in all sorts of different ways. So sometimes, I mean, the wine that we drink, the wine that we may be drinking in 15 minutes time, is a gift of Dionysus. Its magical properties are down to the fact that Dionysus presides over the wine in some sort of sense. What I was talking about in terms of the mainstream view of Greek religion was a sort of a sliding conception of that shift between, on the one hand, thinking with Dionysus is in the wine. I mean, actually, the wine itself is Dionysus. On the other hand, thinking of Dionysus as an anthropomorphic god who might appear in our world, who might come and sit down next to you and have a chat with you. And they're completely different ways of thinking of divinity. Now, my argument was that the idea that Dionysus is wine, that wine and Dionysus are the same thing, is ultimately leads to a sort of atheistic conception. And that's what you find in people like Prodicus. Prodicus' argument is an atheistic argument. It's that gods aren't real. Gods don't have any explanatory power at all. They are simply misunderstandings, but primitive ways of conceptualizing the world. So if you think that Dionysus is wine, then that kind of position leads to this sort of atheistic position.
So it's like reduction to the point of atheism.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was also arguing that it's a spectrum between the overly intuitive on the one end and the overly counterintuitive on the other end. So the overly intuitive end of it is thinking of Dionysus as wine. In that, if you say that all wine is Dionysus, then the explanatory power of Dionysus becomes zero. You're just saying, all fire is Hephaestus, and all, then you're not actually adding anything to your world by describing it as Hephaestus or Dionysus. So it's overly intuitive. It doesn't have any of that sort of magical kind of quality, sort of the counterintuitive quality that religious thinking needs. At the other end, there is the epiphanic model, which is where, as I say, gods appear in our world. And that, for the Greeks, was often overly counterintuitive because they simply couldn't get their head around how Paris and Apollo could fire the bow simultaneously at the same time. It just doesn't make sense. So so I was arguing that Greek religion shuttles between the one and the other. It's got both concepts of God, but it has to have both in play at the same time. And how you get an atheistic read, my project is to just focus on one end. You focus on the metonymic, the sort of this way. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you. A great explained Friday afternoon. But isn't that the point? In a way, the contradictions are there, and cultures can hold these contradictions together, both in thought and practice. I was thinking there was some Christian parallels in some ways, thinking about the point of wine and the God, which I hope we want to be. Let's hope it's an epiphany when we get out there, although you never know. And maybe Christians talk about the devil. The devil and sin to a lesser extent, and the personification of the sins. I'm sure that theological commentators, there is a devil. He turns up in the Bible, the fallen angels, there's a whole theology of the fallen angels, but it's also often used as a metaphor.
Yes.
It's two things. And then even a thinker, I was thinking of the point about Apollo guiding Pharisees. How do we imagine Apollo? Well, Christian thinkers in late antiquity, someone as rigorous as Augustine, does say, well, not everything in history is God coming in and telling people what, or God's finger on every trigger, because that's not how it works. But on the other hand, that's exactly how it works. Because everything is subject to God's providence. So even a thinker as rigorous as Augustine can say basically, well, it can be this, and it can be that, and the fact that it both is one big package. So the contradiction is the point, isn't it, of the culture?
Yes, well, I don't have very much to add to that, except, I mean, it sounds like you picked up one of the things I was working with in the paper, sort of one of the subterranean threads, was the idea of the Eucharist being actually kind of interestingly close to this idea of Dionysus being in the wine, and Dionysus and Christ are often linked as figures in later antiquity. What your comment then made me think of also is, I can't remember where it comes from. Maybe it's an Irish expression, the idea of the devil in the bottle as well. So the devil also can inhabit the drink as well. The devil drink the demon brew and all that sort of stuff. So yes, the idea that wine can be thought of as possessing a kind of divine savour is something that connects all of these modes of thinking. But yes, I don't know all lessons well enough to comment on it, but it's very, I mean, it sounds entirely plausible because it is, I don't know, it's a sort of unresolved and irresoluble question in religion generally, isn't it? How far do we want to see our world as entirely dominated by the religious? The Greeks were very resistant to that. They called that superstition. If you think that absolutely everything that happens to you all the time is some sort of manifestation of divine will, that's paranoid madness. Whereas, so Plutarch writes precisely on this. He says, at one end you've got that kind of person, on the other end you've got the atheist who thinks that absolutely nothing in the world is any outside from the God. And somewhere in the middle is where he locates religiosity, but it's very hard to get that balance right.
And that's what Robert Marcus argued that happens in the 6th century, the Christian era, is the madness takes over. That the religiousness saturates everything, and the seculum, the safe space, disappears. With results that are not all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm interested in what you've been talking about, the sort of negotiation of the religious and the non-religious. And I wonder to what degree you think that was a concern of the average worshipper for whom religion is just part and parcel of everyday life, and it's perhaps closer to divine immanence, that it's just things are religious, and that's in the same sense that today, maybe, if you speak to particularly observant ultra-Orthodox Jews, non-religious activities don't exist. Everything they do is religious. I just wonder for the average person of the Greek polis, or what do you think these were things that they were preoccupied by?
Yes, well that's, I mean, obviously one can't answer that question because you can't, but it's a really important thought experiment to do, because I mean, I'm very aware that the counter-argument to a lot of what I've been saying is you're dealing with a bunch of rarefied intellectuals, and of course they're going to twist things and do weird, cookie things with it. But for most people, I mean, and it's quite evidently true that Greek religion was a fully functioning system for 1,000 years or more. So it can't have had that much of structural weakness in it. I still think, though, that, I mean, that's part of the reason why I wanted to work with Homer's Iliad, which is the text. I mean, if we want, it's not biblical in its authority, but if we want something that has that sort of sense of being a central proof text for Greek culture, the Iliad really is that. And the Iliad doesn't hide the nature of the problem. The Iliad really sort of stimulates these problems. And as I say, you've got, I mean, I mentioned Heraclitus, the commentator on the Iliad. He's not the only commentator by long means. People always worry with this question of what Homeric gods actually, how to interpret them in any kind of plausible way. So it seems to me that whilst it must be true that, well, okay, to answer it in a different way, to go back to cognitive science of religion, there is an aspect of that which is called dual process theory, which is about how we make decisions. Okay, there is intuitive decision making and reflective decision making. Intuitive decision making is an evolutionary adaptation that allows us to make decisions with minimal cognitive effort. So when a president or presidential candidate says, "Hey, I'm going to make your country great again," you think, "Oh yes, yeah, that sounds good. I'll make it, and I'll take that to the bottom." And you don't necessarily go through all the process of thinking how exactly you're going to do that. Okay. The reflective mode of reasoning takes much more work, but it's clearly an important part as well of what makes us human and how we function. And actually, we were talking earlier about children. I think children are very prone to reflective reasoning. It's the children that often ask the question, how does that work? How does that take me through the steps on it? So it's not necessarily a sort of higher, more sophisticated level, but it's another part of what makes us human. So the reason I say this is because clearly some people are more prone to reflective reasoning than others. Certainly you can develop these skills, and that's kind of what we do at universities, really, sort of amplify the reflective side of things and try and reduce the, not necessarily reduce, but sort of recontextualise the intuitive side of decision making. So there are all sorts of factors that go into why people, might just run with religion, and they might just, not think about it ever, or they might really agonise about it. Some of it is personality, some of it is training, some of it is time of life, and so forth. But all I can say is that I suspect that if you spoke to average Joe Athenians, the answer wouldn't be a simple single one. It wouldn't be that most people go, it's fine, I don't really care about it. Some of them would actually work.
Time for one more question, and I think the gentleman. Sorry, I was looking the wrong arm. Meaning you, yes.
Where do the mortal offspring of gods fit into this? Are they just dismissed as fictitious inventions by atheists?
So mortal offspring of deities. In historical times, which is when we get the atheists, we don't get atheists in the myth. We could argue that, but I mean, by and large, atheism is a sort of historical phenomenon that begins in the 5th century BCE. Okay, and at that time, nobody would say, "I'm the child of a deity." If you said that, people would say, "Your parents weren't married," something like that. So it's not really a question that poses itself as such in real world scenarios. And when it comes to myth, when the philosophers treat myth, they never